Stakeouts were not as easy as some might assume they are. James Troy knew that from the day he started being a sleuth. It's not about sitting on your rear and watching the same doors for hours on end. There's knowing the right vantage point, memorizing patterns in behavior and traffic in your area of observation, searching for any slight discrepancies in visitors, attitudes, even mannerisms. Every detail mattered, and all of them must be accounted for, while also making sure that you weren't discovered by your target or onlookers. The day had to be business as usual. It was a long and sometimes boring affair, but there were few as adept at it as James Troy. He sat in his car, binoculars by his side and a coffee cup in the opposite seat. He had a notepad in his lap, which had notes jotted down of different activities throughout the evening that he'd noticed. He watched men and women go in, leave, park, stop to smoke, but no sign of anything too out of the ordinary. It had been like this for days now. He had to tell Elizabeth to keep renewing their reservation because he had to make sure that he was there at the exact moment something went down. See, one of the primary rules of stakeouts is that you try to avoid direct interaction or contact with the persons or locations you're observing, but you have to be ever vigilant. James felt it might be necessary in this instance to actually make an exception to those rules, though. The feeling in his gut wouldn't go away about Dock 4. He knew something was wrong about it. He couldn't get a real vantage point from where he sat, so maybe it was time to stop waiting in his car and actually make a move. He had to see Dock 4 again and see for himself. But he couldn't be hasty. Giving away his position and activities would ensure that anything the Dock had hidden would be swept away. Now it was the twilight hour, and his movements would be a little less conspicuous. He finally stepped out of the car, pulled his hat over his head to better mask who he was, and then started running. With a running sprint, he passed across the street towards the fence. He grunted and jumped up, grabbing the wiring and hauling himself over the edge, dropping down with a dull thud that shook his teeth. "Crap," he sneered. "Can't wait to try getting back over that again," he muttered as he moved quickly to the shadows. It was nearly 100 meters to Dock 4, and for now, he had to be slow and methodical. Laced around his neck was his camera, which he intended to use to take some photos of the scene in question. He could look over them at his leisure back at the office. As he moved silently between the buildings and slipped behind shipping boxes and containers, he noticed something was wrong. He could hear talking, voices not far off, but it wasn't English. He seemed to know the language from somewhere, but where? No point in guessing it. He had to see for himself. Slow and methodically, he crept silently along until he came very close. He could make out a few lights coming from Dock 4. He slipped behind a large stack of crates and pulled out his camera to take a few photos of the scene. Carefully, and with the patience of a stalking cat, he slipped his head up with the camera and then froze before he could even take the picture. "My God," he hissed. Just as he whispered the phrase, he ducked his head back down again as a man turned in his direction. James's palms were sweaty from the shock. His teeth were clenched so tight, not even air would be allowed to escape his mouth. He might as well have just seen a great sea monster rising up from the waters, for his heart was beating a mile a minute. Waiting patiently again, he leaned back, finally looked out and began snapping pictures rigorously, getting every shot he could before ducking back down. "What on earth is that thing doing here?" he whispered under his breath. "I have to get this film developed immediately." But before putting away his camera, James took a brief moment to get a head count of the men surrounding the behemoth before him. He saw at least 8 armed men carrying guns and hand grenades. They were well dressed and well armed, and they were moving with speed and precision as one would expect from a machine of war. It would be suicide to get any closer, and yet James had a longing to see just what these men were doing here and why that ship was here. Just as he was about to slip back into obscurity, he stopped as another man entered the scene. His blonde hair stood out, as did his unkempt suit and tie. It was the overweight dock owner that he and Elizabeth had just spoken to a few days ago. He strolled up to the armed soldiers without any trouble or care, and even shook one of their hands as they spoke in that same language that James now had no question as to what it was. Biting his lip, he took another snapshot of the traitorous fellow before slinking back into the shadows of the dock houses, and began turning to run back for his car. He couldn't be caught or suspected, not now. A part of him felt a sense of shame for turning tail and running, but the reality of this discovery was too great to be left alone. He had to get back to the restaurant and talk to Elizabeth. He would have to sort this out with her before going forward with anything. If what he'd seen was real and not just a dream, then he knew exactly why Pablo was killed and exactly what Doc 4 was hiding from the world.
A Nazi U-boat?
Keep your voice down. Troy was seated in a very classy restaurant. Fortunately, on the second balcony floor, there were fewer patrons or guests at this time of night, so he and Frost had more privacy to talk. But it wasn't like she wouldn't draw attention anyway. While he looked dirty and exhausted with his shabby coat, hat, and grungy business collar and tie, Elizabeth Frost looked like she'd stepped out of a wet dream. Dressed in a strapless, form-fitting cocktail dress that accentuated her assets and was cut at the thighs in such a way as to make every step show significant skin, and heels that clicked on tile announcing her every move, she was the picture of beauty. Her face required a little makeup, and her hair had been styled glamorously, and yet naturally. James felt his heart flutter just staring at her, but not like it had pounded upon seeing the U-boat.
I'm sorry, but a U-boat in the harbor? Are you certain? Frost asked.
I was close enough to see the swastikas on their sleeves. They're the real deal. Some of them look like SS, James answered.
But what are they doing here? America isn't involved in those squabbles.
You really think that'll last? Troy asked. It won't be long before we're caught in the thick of it, just like the French and the Russians. I don't know exactly what a U-boat is doing here, but if I had to stake a guess, they want to make sure we don't get involved. Or at least if we do, they'd be able to strike at an early hit on our home soil. Frost shivered a moment and squirmed in her chair at the table.
It's horrifying, thinking about the idea of an attack here.
Which is why this is so serious. We have to find out what the Germans want here and why they're sneaking around the harbor at night. I think we should...
Excuse me.
Troy and Frost looked up to see a waiter walk by with a bottle of wine. Casually, he reached over and poured a reasonable amount for both of their glasses before walking away. Troy raised an eyebrow. You ordered wine?
You're buying.
Who said that?
I did. Just now. Frost winked.
Did I mention that you're fired? He hissed.
Oh, you can't fire me. What would you do without me?
Frost giggled. I'd be financially stable at least, Troy groaned, sipping the wine and then smirking. This is pretty good.
I think I know a thing or two about good wine. I figured you'd like this Cabernet.
Anyway, we're getting off topic, Troy interjected.
Right, sorry, Frost agreed. So, what do we do now? I think we might want to go to the police about this, maybe?
I did snap a few pictures, but I'm worried if we involve the local police, it might force the Nazis to start speeding up their plans or force their hands early. Plus, not to be pessimistic, but the cops would come snooping around and that'll look all kinds of suspicious. I think for the time being we keep our cards close to our chest, Troy replied, sipping the wine again.
So, what's our plan, James?
We're going back. We're going back. Tomorrow night, I want to get a closer look at that U-boat.
We?
I'm not going back there without backup, James winked. Frost beamed and leaned forward on the table.
I knew you'd need me sooner or later to come and keep you safe.
Why have you got to be such a flirt? Troy growled.
Don't pretend you don't enjoy it.
And he did. James secretly loved it when Frost toyed with him like this. In a strange way, Frost could break the icy shell around his sensibilities. No matter how cold or secluded he was, she could heat him up in ways he couldn't describe. He would never be able to fire her. In the most bizarre of ways, she helped complete him. I'll get the picture developed when I get home. I'll hit the Red Room right away and see what I can make out of them. I'll need your help tomorrow analyzing them. 2 sets of eyes will be better than 1, I'd say, Troy explained.
I'll go home and get some rest after this, but maybe I can do some snooping around in the old nightclubs and gin joints. Maybe some dock workers or night owls know a thing or two about what's going on.
You're going back into singing? Troy asked.
It's a good front for getting information. I find men are a lot more talkative when I bat my eyes and pucker my lips.
Frost giggled. Stop it, James groaned.
Stop what?
This. Whatever this is, Troy explained. Frost blinked in confusion and leaned back in her chair. Elizabeth, if you're trying to make me jealous or something...
Jealous?
Elizabeth suddenly did something she never did before. She blushed.
James, are you...
I'm not, James growled. I know you're good at playing this game, and I wish I could say I was as familiar with the rules as you are, so I won't even bother stepping up to the table. I'll leave that to you. As for me, I have my own game, and if you'll excuse me... Troy stood up from the table and tossed a few bills. That'll pay for the wine.
James, wait.
Elizabeth rose to her feet and James glanced back at her. Every minute we waste, the Nazis get closer, whatever it is they're doing. We don't have time for this. He didn't want to say what this was. They both knew. And knew without ever having to utter it.
I understand, Frost answered. But James, I don't want you to feel like we can't...
It wouldn't work, Elizabeth, he answered. And you know it wouldn't. No matter how much we might want it to. Without another word, he walked off and out into the damp and dank night, away from the fluttering heart he had in the restaurant. It was better he left that heart behind. It didn't help him one way or another, but little did James know that he hadn't left it behind. He'd merely set it aside, waiting to give it away.